Here we are. So we're really excited. Thank you all so much for joining. My name's Jaz, and I use they and she pronouns. Nathan, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Nathan Alexander. I recently joined the Natural Resources Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team, and I'm presenting this in part with the LGBT Resource Center. I use he, him pronouns and do wildlife work.
So I think before we get started, we wanted to just provide a little bit of insight on what motivated Nathan and others on this talk to put this presentation together. And so how long ago has it been now? Has it been?
We started putting together this presentation in February, I believe. And the real driving force was a lot of the transphobia we saw in regards to Dr. Levine's appointment. And there were a lot of comments equating sex to chromosomes, and it was an oversimplification of what sex determination is. And so we wanted to create a resource that could be widely shared, affirm trans and intersex identities within science, and just push back against this kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah. So I'm really excited. There's quite a few people that have put work into this. So there's multiple perspectives. We have my perspective. So I teach LGBTQ and gender-related things, but I'm trained in human development and family studies. I'm a doctoral candidate in that department at the University of Illinois. I'm also on the board with Uniting Pride, and so I was really excited to bring this here. Nathan, what are the other scholars that are on this project?
So we have Jamie Kuhn, who has a doctorate in natural resources, and her focus is predominantly in sociology as well as wildlife. And then we have Alida de Fleming, who does genetics, also doctorate in animal sciences, I believe, who does ancient genetics, works with indigenous communities, and also works a lot with elephant genetics. And then we have Tolu Perenstow, who also just recently got their doctorate. So lots of young professionals starting out who contributed to this. And Tolu is also a geneticist. So we really wanted to integrate genetics, wildlife, and the different understandings of life histories of different taxa or different wildlife out there, as well as having the human dimensions side.
So social science side, developmental side. And so, yeah, should we go ahead and get started?
Sure. Can you put the screen up, please?
Yes. Are you sharing your screen?
Mm-hmm. There we are.
There we are.
Okay. Okay, so this talk in particular has been adapted specifically for this audience, and this is co-sponsored by Uniting Pride and the University LGBT Resource Center. We really want to make sure that people know what this resource is and what it is not. So we are wildlife ecologists, wildlife geneticists, social scientists. This is just an introduction, and this is a finite resource. We're not medical professionals, and we don't want to reinforce the narrative that queer or transgender identities are dependent on biological sex. And so just kind of keep that with you as we go through this presentation. We really want to emphasize that science should not gatekeep trans identities. This presentation is not about that. And this presentation is really focusing on how sex is a non-binary system in animal systems, as well as expanded into humans. We're going to start off this talk by talking about sex assignment in wildlife, and we're going to cover various ways that we determine that. And then we're going to talk about some non-binary reproductive systems within wildlife. Finally, we're going to talk about some definitions of sex and gender within humans. So part one is wildlife, and I took all of these photos on different wildlife jobs. And it's always great to get out and explore different regions. But we're going to start off with the history of the Y chromosome. So the genes are specific sites on a chromosome, and the Y chromosome is what is typically associated with a male sex assignment. And this is generally from the SRY gene, which is on the Y chromosome. However, this is not consistent across species, and this is kind of, the SRY is kind of viewed as a master switch gene, which triggers all of the other phenotypic changes into a stereotypical male body. Of note is that the Y chromosome was discovered in the 1900s, and we keep finding, it took a while to narrow in on this single gene. So at first it was a Y chromosome, and then it was this region on the Y chromosome that we found in the 1960s. And then we just kept zeroing in until by the 1990s, we identified the single gene on the Y chromosome that triggers all of this. And so what does the SRY gene actually do? So it activates this other gene, SOX9, into forming testes. But the actual mechanism for this is much more complex. And so all of these interactions between these genes that are typically associated with males or associated with females are areas where our bodies might not have that connection or might have a variation. And so these are very complex intersections and reactions. I have a friend who's a doctor, and I remember when he was in med school, one of his favorite things was just talking about how messy the human body was, where everything was just being secreted, and these connections were kind of happenstance based upon whether or not certain chemicals got to the correct places. So if we apply this to wildlife, we first have to define wildlife. Some people might have an inherent understanding of what this is, but just to be explicit, we're talking about mammals, birds, reptiles, and living things that are not human and they're not domesticated. So kind of what you see outside your window from day to day. And wildlife has a wide diversity of sex assignment. So there's the evolution of sex chromosomes, which is not necessarily irreversible. There's a various chromosomal sex determination where the chromosomes that code for sex are different between species, and the number of chromosomes are different between species. There's species that undergo sex change midlife. And then there's external factors that can also predict sex. So temperature can drive sex as well as hormone levels. And we even have some species that are single sex. So the first question is, why do we even care about sex? Generally, in wildlife, it's a simplification that we use for models so that we can kind of understand population dynamics. And we don't particularly care if an individual is male or female. We're more interested in whether or not an individual has a reproductive capacity so we can get a better understanding of that population. Very commonly, we look at female-only population models so that we can understand the production of offspring and the recruitment into a pride. And the other reason why we look at sex and wildlife is that it can help us design specific conservation and anti-poaching strategies. So for Alita's work, a lot of Alita's work looked at elephants, and they could see that whether or not poachers were targeting solitary males or herds based off of the sex assignment, because there was a behavioral interaction dependent upon sex. Also, it's important for extinct species where we don't necessarily understand or know the population demographies that are happening on the landscape. And kind of in pairing with this, we also rely heavily on museum specimens occasionally. And our museum collections are very specific dependent upon sex because we were looking at flashy birds. So if a bird had a male plumage, it was more likely to be taken for a museum collection than if it was a female. However, we know that intersex individuals occur in wildlife. Einfeld et al. In 2019 described an instance where there were intersex whales where, based off of the physical appearances, they categorized them as one sex, but based off of dissection afterwards, they found out that they were female, I believe. And so it's really important to note that these are all models that we're relying on. And in wildlife, we tend to do our best, but we are inevitably missing intersex individuals within our assessments if we're just going by kind of these physical attributes. How we define sex is also very dependent upon the species we're talking about. For instance, I mostly work with small mammals. And so when we look at these, we don't just note whether or not they're male or female. We look at their reproductive status and the development of different glands as well. And we code them across these different categories. So, you know, we're interested in if a female is non-reproductive, if they're pregnant, if they're post-lactating, or if they're regressed, which means that they were previously lactating but are no longer. And then in songbirds, we look at plumage, cloacal protuberance, as well as plumage, brood patch, but there's also Genandromorphs. So recently, I believe it was in the Kankakee region, there was a Genandromorph cardinal where the bird was half male and half female. And so these are kind of the structures that we're looking at on small mammals, where we look for the testy development, we look for hair loss around the nipple to indicate nursing, and we assign sex based off of these categories. And for birds, we look at it's the cloaca in particular, especially during breeding season, as it will become engorged. And there's different categories for breeding status for birds. However, if we look more into birds in particular, there's this condition called Genandromorphs, where they can be split between the sexes in a single organism. And they've recently kind of developed this idea that this is cell-specific rather than organism-specific. So it's thought to be due to having different chromosomes. So in birds, they have a ZZZW chromosomal pattern. And one of the interesting things about this is that the master switch gene in birds, which is DRMT1, it may determine sex, but it's not necessarily determining the sexual characteristics in birds, which is kind of unlike what we see in mammals. As I go forward, I also just want to point out how recent these papers are. And so this is still a developing field, and there's not necessarily an answer because a lot of this is still relatively new and is being explored. So as we go forward, we're going to be talking some about chromosomes, but there's different types of chromosomes as well. And so there's these homomorphic chromosomes, and that's where the chromosomes look similar to each other. So if you look at the left hand of the figure, the XZ and YW chromosome are about the same height, and those would be homomorphic. However, over evolutionary time, a sex-determining chromosome may become more reduced, and those are called heteromorphic. And so that's kind of what we understand with humans, where there's the X chromosome and then the Y chromosome is significantly smaller. And animals can have different arrangements, and they kind of follow along this dependent upon their sex-determining chromosomes. Ploidy is going to be the number of chromosomes that an individual has. And then in wildlife, we use the term hermaphroditism, which means that animals either have both reproductive organs or they shift between the sexes over time. And of note, we use this in wildlife. We don't particularly use this for humans unless somebody self-identifies. With other ways that sex can be determined is based off of environmental factors, which means that there's a non-genetic factor that determines sex. And then there's the genetic factors that can determine sex, such as hormones, DNA, and phenotypes. And looking across taxa, there's a wide array of what can cause sex determination. Mammals tend to be chromosomal or thought to be chromosomal with the XO and XY. However, if you look over at reptilia, there's a lot that are environmentally determined, or they have Z and ZW chromosomes. And if you look over at the fish in the teleosteae, there's hermaphroditism. And the more you look at this, there's just a lot of ways that different species can reproduce or have what we determine a specific sex. So in humans and in mammals, it tends to be that the males will have the heteromorphic chromosomes of X, Y. However, in birds, it's the males who have the homomorphic chromosomes, where it's a double Z, and the females have the ZW. And so even these chromosomal combinations, or whether or not it's homomorphic or heteromorphic, is dependent upon the species. And along with this, species can have a wide range of chromosomes that are involved in determining sex. So typically we think of mammals, which have kind of the two sex-determining chromosomes. Birds tend to also have the two. But if we expand and start looking at specific species, like the platypus, there's actually 10 chromosomes involved in determining the sex. And so we're just kind of pushing back at this kind of, so an XY necessarily means male, because if you look at platypus, which are mammals, there's this wide range of chromosomes involved in determining their chromosome, or in determining their sex. In wildlife and in science, there's kind of this concept called the evolutionary trap hypothesis. And that idea is that once a sex chromosome is developed, it stays that way, and it won't change easily. However, through simulations, we've been able to see that this isn't necessarily true. Sex chromosomes can change very quickly. Sex chromosomes can be undifferentiated over most of their length. And our understanding of chromosomes have come from species with very different sex chromosomes, because we as people are very interested in why are things different. And so we tend to focus in on these species or these examples where there's this high variation between the sexes, but this is not necessarily the majority of the species. So bear with me a little bit for a genetic class. We're going to walk through how a sex gene can kind of develop, and then how that can impact a sex chromosome. And so we're going to start with this, where we have two chromosomes that don't have any sex determining characteristics. And then through mutation, one of these chromosomes gains a sex determining gene. And through continuous recombination, because genes like their neighbors, these areas on the chromosome become associated with a specific sex. And so you might start seeing phenotypic differentiation at this point. However, through degeneration, we start adding more genes and taking away genes on this. And eventually, through this cyclical process, we wind up with this reduced chromosome that has had a lot of deletions through it. And eventually, the chromosome itself can be completely deleted. And one example where this has probably happened is the creeping vole. So this study was published earlier this year, over the summer. And in this species, males have XX chromosomes, and they're inherited both maternally as well as paternally. And of note, both the maternal and parental X chromosomes have multiple SRY genes, which is what we think of as determining whether or not an individual will be male or not. However, the female creeping voles have the same level of this gene as males of different species. And so this is just a really fascinating example that is fairly recently discovered of this gene being present in both males and females, and it's just dependent on copy number, but then the phenotypes of the females is not influenced by this gene. And so our understanding of the SRY gene is still kind of developing and being understood. as we start looking at broader taxa, we start seeing other things like sequential hermaphroditism. And this is when an individual will change its sex over time. And this is really common in fish, and it can allow adaptation, increases survival, can increase reproduction. And it's fairly common in a lot of specifically reef fishes. They can change from male to female in a form called protandry, and this can be size dependent, or it can be through social cues. And then other species can also change from female to male in protogeny. And this happens in amphibians, fish, and various other taxa as well. And my favorite example of this, of course, is Finding Nemo. So clownfish are a sequentially hermaphroditic species. And so the clownfish lives in pairs with a male and female, and the social hierarchy is dependent on size, where the largest fish is the female. However, when the female fish dies, the dominant male will change sex into a female and start producing eggs. And so once Nemo's mother was out of the system, Marlin, the father, would have started producing eggs. And then an immature fish would become the mature male in that system. From here, we're going to talk very briefly about kind of environmental sex determination as well as genetic sex determination. And sex can be determined through outside impacts as well. So environment can play a huge impact in some species' determination of sex. And one of the prime examples of this is temperature-dependent sex. And this is very common in reptiles. And it allows a level of plasticity for the species, which historically were beneficial. However, as humans have impacted climate, it can pose a conservation issue where there can be large changes in the environments that skew the sex ratios and can collapse some of these colonies. And then these species can also have non-uniform responses as well. So as temperature increases, we might see an increase in the number of female sea turtles. However, with crocodiles, we see females developing at lower and higher temperatures, where the males only develop at the mid-temperature range. And so even across species, the response to environmental sex determination is going to vary. And so again, we're looking at very specific examples dependent upon the taxa we're studying. Hormones can also play a very specific part in sex development. And so Jost in 1948 found that hormones drive phenotypic expression in males, and he did this by removing testes from fetal rabbits and then watching how the fetuses developed. And so he determined that gonads were needed for the male phenotype, but not necessarily for the female phenotype. And I do kind of want to point out that hormones and the understanding of hormones kind of have historically been very oddly studied. So in the late 1800s, there was a person who was actually injecting himself with blood and semen from the testicular area of animals and trying to see if that gave him vitality. So it's important to note that that at one point was considered kind of a scientific experiment, and we're moving past that, and luckily we're not there anymore. But essentially they found that hormones were secreted by these organs, the ovaries or testes, and testosterone led to kind of these development of the vas deferens and ducts that are typically associated with what is typically called a male reproductive system, and other hormones act to prevent female reproductive systems from forming. One interesting thing is that estrogen can actually cause gonadal shifts in marsupials as well. So again, the way that hormones are interacting across species, even within mammals, kind of depends on what we're looking at. With fish, environmental and visual cues can also cause hormone production. And so this was a specific study where they put two fish together of the same sex, And they did it across several different trials where they had the two fish in the same tank, and then the smaller fish would change to female, or the larger fish would change to male. And they were wondering if this was due to hormones or if it was due to other factors. And so they put a divide between the tanks where the water didn't allow hormone transfer between the fish, and they still saw these changes occur. However, when they had the fish isolated and alone, the males did not change sex, but the females would change to male. So I'm sharing my screen, so I can't see any questions, but if there's any questions in the chat, we can kind of pause and see if there's anything. And Jazz, you might have to read them for me.
I do not see any questions at this moment, Ethan.
Okay.
We can wait a couple seconds if we want, but
we can keep going.
Okay.
And if there's questions, feel free to drop them in the comments or chats, and I'll try to address them as I can. So we've kind of talked a lot about how sex assignment in wildlife is very varied, how it can be dependent upon different factors, different systems. And so we're going to talk a little bit now about non-binary reproductive systems in wildlife. So one of the key non-binary reproductive systems in wildlife is called parthenogenesis. And this is actually asexual reproduction. And this is where an individual can reproduce, and it's common in plants, invertebrates, and more than 80 species are known of fish, reptiles, and amphibians that can do this. And there's different ways that this can happen. There can be what is kind of termed accidental, where the species tends to reproduce sexually, but then an offspring might be produced by a female in captivity without any male presence. I think I just saw recently that a female shark that was alone in a tank gave birth recently. But this happens across taxa as well. There's records of boa constrictors doing this, or pythons. There's facultative, where generally offspring it's kind of a toss-up how offspring are produced, either through parthenogenesis or through sexual reproduction. And then there's obligate parthenogenesis, where females cannot reproduce sexually, or there's female-only species where they just reproduce through this asexual mechanism. And one really interesting example of asexual reproduction are these ambystoma salamanders. So we actually have these in Illinois as well. And essentially, they do not comply with our understanding of evolution at all. So they can possess multiple sets of chromosomes. So they're polyploid, if you remember that. And they can have anywhere from 2 to 5. The offspring may be clones of their mother, or they might have added genetic material through what is known as kleptogenesis, where a female takes genetic material from a male, but it's from a different species. It's closely related, but it is a different species. And specifically with these ambystoma salamanders, they can take genetic material from multiple fathers and have that in a single offspring. And so these are fairly not well understood at this point, but they're a really cool salamander. And then there's also behavior that can impact sexual reproduction. So this is the rough. And there are 3 color morphs generally for males, which you can see on the screen. There's the independent males, which are darker, and they tend to be more aggressive than the satellite males, which have the white ruff. And generally in these colonies, the independent males will kind of establish territories, and the satellite males will be at the edge of them. However, there's also these fader males, which have similar plumage as the female of the species, and they avoid violent attention from other males. And what's really interesting about this system is that it's stable. So this evolved around 4 million years ago. And so this social dynamic, as well as this genetic component of phenotypes, is stable within this system. And the fader males and the satellite males and the independent males are all maintained. When we start talking specifically about kind of these terms for animals that present outside of the sex binary, there's a lot of human terminology or human morality that we tend to apply as well. So in roughs, we call them faders. This also occurs in salmon called jacks. However, in science, at least the term I learned when I was younger was called sneaker male. And we kind of really wanted to highlight that this might be a problematic phrase that you encounter if you delve into this literature, because it kind of assumes this human motivation that it is sneaking. And also specifically, this is kind of along the lines of the bathroom arguments we hear around whether or not trans people have a right to bathrooms. And so we really wanted to highlight that we advocate for species-specific terms, and this is for wildlife. So we use faders for roughs, jacks, and salmon, and we move away from the term sneaker male. So overall with wildlife, there's many different forms and influences on sex. And so across taxa, across evolution, we've seen all of these really exciting and really different ways that species can propagate themselves and maintain their place on Earth. And there's not necessarily a single route that works. So as we consider sex and sex determination, we really need to be focused on what we're asking, as well as kind of understanding where it falls within this larger understanding. While doing research for this, one of my favorite quotes was from this Stavant et al. 2018 paper, where they pretty much highlight, overall, it has become clear that the cascade of events governing sex determination is far more complex than originally anticipated. Hence, one must refrain from any rigid preconceptions and instead embrace new concepts and actual facts as they emerge. And this is just really important that we maintain an open mind about sex. It's something that is still very poorly understood in the scientific community. And it's not as simple as chromosomes, and I hope that has been shown somewhat. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Jaz to talk about humans.
All right. Oops. All right, so I'm excited, and I saw some comments in there, Nathan. I don't know if you got to see them, but Jerry said, who knew about all the different species and their ability to switch? And so I think it's really fascinating that, you know, we have all of these variations, even in wildlife, and it's silly for humans to think that even though we're of this earth, that our sex does not have variations as well. So that's what I'm going to talk to you all about. So right here, and I use this quite often in other talks, but the gender unicorn is a fabulous visual that trans students came up with to kind of help us think about several different constructs that we might experience as very linked and tied together, but are different. So at the top, you see gender, and it's defined as one's internal sense of being maybe a man, a woman. You can think of this as identifying as neither of these or both or any other gender, right? So there's multiple gender identities, and you can mark yourself here with that. There's also, you see sex assigned at birth on this as well. I'm not going to go through everything on this graphic, but when you look at sex assigned at birth, you see that you can pick female, male, other / intersex, and what this is denoting is that the classification of people as male, female, intersex, or another sex, you can select based on a combination of anatomy, hormones, chromosomes, right? What's interesting is, and Nathan pointed this out, is that the other ones that you can mark on here is kind of on a spectrum, right? You can mark wherever you think you fall with masculinity, femininity, when you're thinking about gender expression, even identity, gender identity, but you can't, and this is with sex, mark that. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about sex kind of being on a spectrum, or sex being having more variations than one or two, or even just three, even intersex. So I wanted to first talk about biological determinism. Basically, this is just used to denote that males and females, based on chromosomes, hormones, sex organs, and other physical characteristics. Basically, it's harmful if it's applied, sorry, I got tongue-tied, to humans, and it oversimplifies sex. It's looking at sex as not just something that we live and we experience, but thinking about sex beyond what that's denoting, right? It can include how we're socialized within the world. I'm getting super tongue-tied, sorry you all. But it's how humans tie gender to the body. So we're going to talk about the oversimplification of sex determination. And so here I put the different sex chromosomes on the side. Nathan already kind of talked about this briefly. The common formations are XX, which we generally assign to female, and XY, which we generally assign to male. But as we know, and as the world shows us, some individuals per 1,000 are born with maybe one sex chromosome, so they could be marked as 45X, or you'll sometimes see 45XO. Some people are born with 3 or more sex chromosomes, so they might be 47XXX, 47XYY, 47XX, etc. But these individuals have chromosomes, formations, gonads, hormones, all those other things we talked about that vary, right? And so these individuals are intersex. You also might hear terms such as intersex variations, intersex differences. Not all people who have these, or you'll sometimes also hear conditions, but not all people who are intersex use that language. And so it's very important to use a language based on what the individual identifies as. But for this talk, I'll kind of go back and forth with intersex, or what is considered differences of sex determination. So you'll see DSD, or not just differences. Sometimes in the graphics, it'll say disorders, but we've moved away from using that type of language. So differences and variations is what you'll mostly hear. All right, so looking at sex as a spectrum, this is a really busy graphic. It's really hard, even when you zoom in, to tell exactly what all is going on. But what happened here was an author wanted to show the complexity of sex in humans. And so if you look at the side, you can see the factors that determine sex, and what is listed as chromosomes, genes, hormones, internal and external sex organs, secondary sex characteristics. And then at the top, it covers the gender spectrum. You can see the different chromosomes at the top. So if you look across, you see 46XX, 45X, and so on. And the different pathways that can vary, the different variations within humans that we've noted thus far as it relates to the specific thing that this author was looking at. So it can be very, very complex. Broadly defined, the DSDs may affect 1% of the population. This is really, I've seen estimates that have really went back and forth. It's important to note that we are likely underestimating the amount of people who are born with intersex variations, just because many people don't ever find out that they have ever had any type of variation or something chromosomally different or whatever. The key here is that, there's a lot of evidence that shows that we should be rejecting these rigid assignments of sex and gender, that it's not binary. And so hopefully you'll look at this graphic and just really explore the different pathways. We're not going to go much into detail with that, but we do have other examples. So looking specifically at sex differentiation, and Nathan talked a lot about this too, determination, differentiation, and how that affected other species. So in humans, what we typically see with XY is, the male differentiation, and XX is the female differentiation. And what happens typically is that the tissue differentiates into testes if that SRY gene that Nathan was talking about earlier is present and functioning. So it can be present but not functioning. Other things can happen, and we'll get into that. The SRY is typically on that Y chromosome, leading to the production of testes, and the internal sex ducts and external genitalia then develop in what you would think as a typical 46XY or male. The further development that happens is driven by the fetal hormones that are produced from those testes, and then the Mullerian inhibiting substances, or MIS, inhibits female internal reproduction development if it's not triggered, if that makes sense. So that is what you would typically see, but we're going to dive into the variations now. And you can see those in the middle. There are at least 25 variations, estimated 120 million globally. So let's look at that. This is the explanation that Nathan already provided with the SRY gene, so I'm going to skip that briefly. But I do want to provide a couple of definitions just as reminders as I'm giving this talk. Again, I am not a complete expert in this, but this is just my understanding of intersex conditions or variations and my ability to help explain that, hey, it's not binary. So quickly, the definitions I want to share is genotype, so that's the genetic makeup of an organism, so it's our genes basically. The phenotype, which we have talked about, is a set of observable characteristics of an individual resulting from the interaction of genotype with environment, or you can think of this as just our observable traits, what we look like. And then karyotype is the number and visual appearance of those chromosomes in the cell nuclei of an organism or species. So I said a moment ago that a lot of people who are intersex don't know. Usually when you're born, the doctor just goes off of phenotype. They look at you, they kind of say, hey, it looks like you're having a girl or a boy, and kind of just take what they can see about sex and relay it in a gender term. We don't do karyotype testing when we're young, so there's no way to really look at those chromosomes. Typically, these tests aren't done unless there's other signs or cues that, hey, something's happening. Maybe puberty is going differently than what was expected. Those types of things. Okay, so here we have a beautiful visual. It's a little more complex if you really look at each gene and what's happening at the chromosomal level. But what we're looking at here is that there is a reciprocal translocation. Basically, what happened was the SRY gene kind of translocated and gave part of it to the other gene. Like they switched. They're like, hey, what's going on? And they shook hands and like something happened, right? They're just hanging out. But that SRY gene is no longer then on the Y chromatid or chromosome, whatever. So it is now on the X, and then therefore the karyotype and phenotype differ. So if we're looking at this graphic, the top that says 1, 2, 3 kind of shows that switching where that SRY gene switched over. And, Nathan explained it much more beautifully earlier, but that's what happened here. And what results from this is that when an egg basically is fertilized, that zygote with the female genotype XX and a feminine phenotype comes out what we would normally think as like typical, right? The typical idea of what we think of feminine sex. And then if a zygote female genotype XX and a masculine phenotype with the SRY that was translocated onto the X chromosome, then you kind of had that masculine phenotype, but female genotype, right? So it's different from what you would expect. Similar with a zygote with a male genotype with the XY and a feminine phenotype, sorry, SRY is missing on the Y chromosome in that case, and so it's different. And a zygote with a male genotype and a masculine phenotype is what you would think is typical. So various different formations that you can look at down at the bottom with the symbols that we would typically expect or what we wouldn't. So they're just hanging out and switching their little pieces and, you know, creating beautiful variations of sex in humans. Short, that's the short version. All right. I don't know why my thing's not moving. There we go. So here is a chart of various different intersex conditions or variations. I like to use variations, but I'm so used to seeing the word conditions, so I apologize for that. So intersex variations. And on this chart, you see the name, what you would think of as the chromosome or genotype, the sex hormone, what you would see for the secondary sex characteristics, and then what you might expect the genitalia to look at birth. So thinking phenotypically. Right here you see Klinefelter syndrome, XXY. This usually happens in males, and they have male levels until puberty, and then female level hormone productions may override that. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in a couple of slides about what that looks like. But the testes are likely underdeveloped. Once the person goes through puberty, they might, at that point, start developing breast or other feminized characteristics, right? However, at birth, often people who are noted as having this variation are assigned male. Then we have the progesterone-induced androgenization. Oh my God, too big of a word. This is basically, and we're going to go through this one as well, where androgen overexposure happens in utero, but then they have female levels from there on. So the person likely has ovaries and a uterus, but they may lack a cervix. They also likely have an enlarged clitoris, but that may or may not be fused or more developed penis without testes, right? So it's kind of interrupting that development and kind of switching it in a different way. Then we have androgen insensitivity syndrome. This is one of the more common ones. It's called AIS, and it can be partial or complete. And I'll go into more detail about that one. Chromosomal level, this is usually XY. The body does not respond to the androgen, so we'll talk about that in utero. But at puberty, the body, again, produces other ones. So we're going to, you can see this chart and kind of go down each one with the chromosomes, the sex hormones, the gonads. I'm going to look at what this means for each exact syndrome or variation, so we kind of understand it from there. For some reason, it keeps sticking. There we go. All right, so androgen insensitivity. Like I said, it can be complete or partial, so we're going to talk about complete first. With the complete, this is XY chromosomal level, but it is resistant to the androgens. So essentially, there's no response to the androgens that are trying to kick in to start the sex differentiation, which means that the male genitalia does not develop, right? So it's signaling, hey, try to develop, and it's like, nah, I don't really want to. So the testes basically remain in the pelvis or abdomen, so they do not descend at that point. At this point, like the chart had mentioned, you may develop like a vulva or clitoris, and you may be assigned female at birth based on feminine-looking genitalia. Typically, you have no uterus. So you can see the graphic up in the corner, and it's basically interrupted when the androgens are pushing, but for some reason, the receptor isn't picking it up, essentially. For partial insensitivity syndrome, there's genital differences that may be labeled as ambiguous or atypical, or thinking of genitalia kind of on a spectrum. So more thinking of different, some feminine characteristics, some masculinized characteristics. And it really varies per person. So it can look typically male, you can look typically female, or somewhere kind of in between. In this version, in the partial insensitivity, what happens is that the testes can make some estrogen, and that estrogen is turned into, or the androgens that are there is turned into that estrogen, and then what that does is it pushes the body to kind of go through a feminizing puberty. And so at this level, if you're going through puberty, the person might then start developing breast or other things that are generally viewed as feminine. You also typically don't have a uterus or little to no pubic hair, and no periods. Again, this one is, and this is common in intersex variations. Often people are unaware until they go to hit puberty, right? And then a puberty that you wouldn't anticipate starts happening. So that's when generally people do the karyotype testing or the other types of testing to figure out, hey, what's going on? This is a beautiful little visual I pulled from this paper, which I highly recommend to look at. I can, give you the full reference if you're interested. But what this walks us through is the process with both the complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, and then it also talks about the deficiency that occurs. Here, trying to remember exactly. The AMH, or anti-Mullerian hormone, is known to be very high in patients with the complete androgen insensitivity. It secretes a specific, it secretes testosterone that suppresses the system. And then it encodes the steroid with a specific enzyme. I'm not going to get I don't know all the specific stuff. So I'm just kind of giving the general, but it encodes it. And then what happens there, it's responsible for converting that testosterone into more potent and developmentally necessary form in order to complete the differentiation. So the specific hormone, therefore, is critical for the masculinization of the genital tissue, looking at what happens with the sexual determination. It also aids in penile growth and prostate development. If it is not triggered because of the improper conversion of testosterone, individuals born with this variation present with undescended testes, but sometimes have normal internal male structures, but also a reduced prostate size. And so what that means is generally people are labeled boy at birth, and then later in puberty might hear or figure this out. But this does present on a spectrum, which I mentioned earlier. It's not necessarily male, female, intersex. It's more moving us towards thinking of our body with variations. And so the genitalia that presents really changes from one person to the next, depending on the levels of if it's complete or if it's partial or whatever specifically took place. If this happened to, if, for instance, this was someone who was born that appeared as a female instead, they're, like I said in the previous slide, they're likely to have an enlarged clitoris. And during puberty, sometimes the testes that didn't descend based on it not picking up that receptor secretes levels of testosterone that might at that point trigger male puberty. So the person who was labeled female at birth may experience getting a deeper voice, increased muscle mass, increased height, things that we view as typical in male puberty. Okay, so now looking at congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So this is also labeled 46XX or 46XY. It is common in 1 in 13,000 births. Again, sometimes these statistics are different, but that was the one I had found specifically with CAH. In this one, it is an inherited hormonal condition, and so people can do testing if they are aware that they carry this gene to see if they're likely to pass this on. It is a recessive one, though, and so if people are interested and they're curious, hey, am I going to pass this on to my kid? You can have it tested. What happens in CAH is that I'm changing my screen really quick, is that the corticosteroids cannot be produced, but the brain, the pituitary gland in the brain keeps like trying and signaling to the body that it needs to produce it. And so the corticosteroids, aren't getting produced, but the body is trying over and over and over. So without the 21-hydroxylase enzyme, that is not produced. And what this does, because the brain, the pituitary gland keeps saying, hey, get on this, you're supposed to be doing this, it results in a larger adrenal gland, so it basically just swells and gets larger. And with that, with the increase, it's just creating more and more sex hormones or androgens instead. So it's creating both it is creating the sex hormones, even though it is not creating the corticosteroid. Sorry. At birth, people with this variation are often, or sometimes can be very unwell. So they could be born and have like low blood sugar at birth, need to, be really, really monitored to make sure that they have that brought up. But with this, because the brain keeps pushing it to produce more, it increases more and more sex hormones, but too little corticosteroids. So in people with XX chromosomes, they may have masculinized genitalia, but ovaries and other internal female reproductive structures do exist, right? So the person chromosomally is female, and you may have some feminized reproductive structures inside, but at birth, you might be marked as a male based on just phenotype. This as well, differences may not appear until puberty, and sometimes people go into early puberty. Sometimes you have irregular periods. Sometimes when you'll start having facial hair. So it really depends. It's pushing different signals out. This is the lovely graphic that I found that described this. Again, you can see typical or CAH, where it was different hormones and everything was promoting a different differentiation. And so you see what's typical versus what would happen otherwise. In this graphic, I like to point out, Okay, so the ovaries of a normal, like not normal, but what a typical 46XX female secretes like neither NCAH. So the absence of that enzyme allows the fetus to produce androgens, which then results in the external genitals being different. So give you a little bit of a visual on that. And, you know, I talked to Nathan about this. I was digging and digging and digging for better visuals that kind of helped show the variations in humans. There's really not that many. It's actually quite sad compared to all the lovely images that Nathan had to share. Okay, so another common one, and you might have heard of this variation, it's called 47XXY or Klinefelter syndrome. In this instance, there's an extra X chromosome, typically in people who are labeled as males. And at conception, the egg or sperm basically experienced non-disconjunction, which prevented the chromosomes from distributing equally during cell division, which I kind of have a little graphic down here for. So what happens is the egg or sperm may end up with an extra X chromosome. So this is what I was talking about when I was going through the different zygotes and what could happen if that wasn't right, if that trigger didn't happen. So the egg is fertilized by the sperm with XY chromosomes and with X. Sorry. This is why I was like, this gets complex. So if at that point that zygote is that switched the SRY gene is then fertilized in either way, if it's the egg or if it's the sperm, whichever, you would end up with Klinefelter variation. And then at I think I read at 8 weeks, that's when you start seeing the differences in your gonads, and the SRY gene on the Y chromosome, like I said, at that point, triggers that development. And so when it triggers that development, it produces the anti-Mullerian hormone and testosterone. This one is quite common. There's actually some debates on whether Klinefelter syndrome should be considered an intersex condition, with it being more and more common. I didn't read too much into like what that debate really looked at, but it is found in like 1 in 600 XY people. Again, with this one, many of the individuals who have this variation are never diagnosed. It's up to like 75. I've seen a range, 60 to 75% are undiagnosed. Typically, if you don't find out during puberty, you might find out when you're attempting to reproduce and, you know, go to a doctor and do a sperm count or whatever and find out, oh, that's what's happening. You know, you might be infertile. So common features with Klinefelter syndrome is that you have smaller than average testes, incomplete or delayed puberty, low testosterone levels. You're taller than you would, like average, you would think. Reduced fertility or infertility. Like I said, this is when people generally find out if they don't find out sooner at puberty. You have decreased muscle mass and bone density, less facial hair and body hair, and a low mood and anxiety typically. The common one that people with X chromosomes typically experience is Turner syndrome, and this is where you only have one X chromosome present. So sometimes you'll see this as 45XO or just 45X. The sex characteristics are underdeveloped because there's only one sex chromosome. The traits with this is that you're usually shorter than average. It said that the person likely has swollen hands and feet, broad chest, and a thicker neck. And so I've shown an image here that kind of talks a little bit about what you would see. It says web neck here, but not that really matters. But it is one of the ones that is more typical with variations that happen in humans. Okay. So there's a lot of information there, and I jumbled my words through a good portion of it. It's complex. That's basically the takeaway. And that is an important takeaway, because a lot of what people understand is just there's only two sexes and it's XY or XX. And that's just not the case. There's several different variations in humans and animals, in all species that live on this earth. And I think we need to do better at accepting that, but also spreading that humans are beautiful in all kinds of varieties. And so SRY isn't everything. A lot of intersex children have had to undergo surgeries as infants. There's been a lot of advocacy to stop these surgeries because it's taking away the person's agency to make that decision for themselves. Intersex healthcare really lags behind a lot of the other healthcare that sexual minorities might experience or have access to. That there's a lot of nuances that happen that we don't really consider. And just because categories were not recognized historically, doesn't mean that they're not important. So we need to recognize and uplift that, variations occur in our sex, variations occur in our gender, and we need to accept that. And we need to explain to people when they don't understand or they try to use the biology argument against various identities. So when you're experiencing the weaponization of these biological arguments, you'll hopefully be able to rely at least somewhat on my explanation of the various different ways that chromosomes can occur and differentiate our sex. I like to ask this question. So how are people with intersex variations impacted by this binary understanding of sex, right? Because we've walked through several different variations, but these individuals are still living in a world that's highly binary, that's highly male-female. And they're raised within a society that the doctors, their parents, all these other adults or role models or whoever in your life are wanting you to conform to one gender or the other, right? Or that's how it's viewed, male or female, man or woman. And so it highly impacts that person's ability to feel a sense of belonging, to not feel stigmatized, especially in historically in how intersex individuals were treated at birth. Doctors really pushed for parents to not tell anyone, to not even tell the child about the variation, because they didn't want the child to experience feeling different. But that really leads to a lot of uncertainty, especially if that child finds out later about their variation and feels like, oh, wow, I could have had a much different life if my parent or my doctor had selected a different gender to raise me as, or a different sex to transform my body to. When you're looking at historically where we're at in our understanding of sexes, pre-Enlightenment, we kind of had a one-sex model of understanding sex. It viewed bodies as two different forms of one essential sex. And so, we just vary, we differentiate in this XY, XX route. But the view is basically that women and men have the same reproductive structures, the vagina similar to the penis, the ovary similar to the testicles, and that we're just variations of that. When this was used, of course, it was very androcentric in that it was still focused mainly on the male, and then the other variation was considered inferior sometimes. I don't like that part, but I do like that it's opened up to understanding sex as having variations, right? And I want to talk about that, and I want to pay attention to why that's so important. But since then, since the 18th century and onwards, we've kind of understood sex in this two-sex model of biology, where we kind of view men and women as very separate, male and females as very different from each other, and not different versions of maybe one type. This kind of led into the biological reductionist view that just boils down gender to biological sex as natural, as not only natural, but what we should aim for, right? It's considered ideal. So the sex binary was what really influenced medical professionals. This two-sex model really influenced medical professionals when they saw variations to understand intersex individuals and bodies as a medical issue that requires fixing. And what I mean by that is that they saw a variation that didn't fit into this nice little male box or nice little female box about our sex. And so they wanted to do something to change that in order to make them fit, right? And so we're going to talk about what that medicalization looks like. Essentially, there were surgical interventions that doctors recommended in order to align intersex bodies to that ideal type. If they, saw phenotypically, they saw that the intersex person looked more female at looking at the genitals, then maybe they would automatically assign female, not even look at chromosome level, not look at internal sex structures or anything else. And based on that, based on just what doctors could see, that's usually how they would recommend the parents to raise that child, or the surgeries that they put in place to make them fit into that box. And a lot of times these surgeries were kind of presented to parents as necessary, when often the surgeries were not necessary, and they could have been delayed for a good amount of time, and at least until the person grew up a little bit and could understand their bodies a little more, and which or what they wanted to do, if they wanted to align their body to a specific sex or not. These different medical interventions have butchered bodies. I have a recommendation in a couple of slides that highlights a documentary that's really, really, really interesting to watch. But you get to learn just how much this impacted intersex people who didn't have that choice, who the agency was taken away. So medical professionals that would perform unnecessary cosmetic surgeries to the point where sex was no longer pleasurable. That wasn't really what mattered, because they wanted to make sure that they weren't judged based on how they looked. Not genetically, based on the genitals. But they also talked about gender socialization and how that can be difficult due to the binary expectations. They understood that because of bodily differences, that the person may experience stigma. And so that's why they told parents to not let the child know, to keep it secret. A lot of times people even moved out of town once they found out, and renamed their child, started, maybe treating a child differently or as a different gender based on whatever surgery happened, to align them to an ideal body. It's heartbreaking, really, once you start looking at all of the specific details that went into these decisions, but also the life that it left for intersex people to carry on and try to figure out once they did know or learn that they have or were born with a variation. So because of that, people, grew up feeling isolated. They felt they had to keep this life secret. They felt ashamed. In that documentary, if you take a minute to watch it, there's one story that highlights, it was a person who every summer he had to have a different surgery to try to fix or try to get this fix or try to get this body to align to a specific male, what would be ideal for a male. And so, each summer, instead of having a normal childhood, he would go off and have to tell his friends, hey, I'm on vacation, when really he was going under surgery after surgery after surgery to try to align his body in this ideal way. So I hope you watch that documentary. It really goes into that in quite a lot of detail. I also really recommend this paper. What it did was it was trying to, after a lot of advocacy happened for intersex people to kind of stop these surgeries, it wanted to look at how are doctors engaging with parents, engaging with our understanding of gender, our understanding of sex as non-binary, to make a decision about medical advice for an intersex baby that was born, essentially. And the paper does note that it's impossible to know an infant's gender identity from biological characteristics, even though that was what was used many, many times for many years. And that doctors and parents, however, still aim to discover a sex. And so it's almost like they dig into all of the different possibilities and try to align still to one specific sex. So for instance, if genitalia looked more masculine, and they might choose that route instead of treating the person like a woman, even if the chromosomes were XX, for instance. So they really are striving for this harmonization between gender and sex traits. And advocates have really asked why. Why is that necessary? It's okay for there to be variations. It's okay to wait until that person can make a decision if they want it to be harmonized or not. And this, of course, isn't situations where it might be completely necessary to do some type of surgery, right, for well-being. But a lot of these were cosmetic. It also notes that healthcare providers are kind of gender gatekeepers who authoritatively validate the construction of heteronormative bodies based on these gender expectations. The physicians in this, or the authors in this, argue that physicians patrolling that boundary between male and female categories kind of skew this process of gender assignment to privilege gender that fit into this biomedical frame that does align to this two-sex model of male or female. Even in instances where they're talking to parents, they looked at chromosome level or karyotypes. They've dug in, or not dug in, they did different tests of blood and other, health workups. They've looked at internal sex organs, what's going on inside, not just outside. Essentially, they decide most often to align the body in a way and kind of disregard what that person might go through with trying to figure out their gender later on, or having to live in a body that, maybe they didn't get to choose. In this paper, they talk about doctors being really comfortable with gender dysphoria, right? If the person is aligned in a way that doesn't suit them, that, okay, well, they'll might experience gender dysphoria, not a big deal. That's how they treat it in here. Instead of the social stigma of having atypical sex traits. And so I think that's important to think about, especially when we're thinking about the rights for intersex and trans people. Gender dysphoria is hard. And, maybe someone should be there and pushing them to not make these decisions based on biological sex or what you can see based on genitalia. So the advocates or intersex activists are really advocating to create spaces and discourses of gender variance instead of reinforcing and validating medical interventions that keep harmonizing gender and sex traits, keep pushing gender to align with sex in this binary way. I recommend looking at the Intersex Justice Project. Other advocates also put out, I think in like 2006, information about what might be considered necessary or not for medical treatment with intersex bodies. And that has been used to promote more knowledge and awareness for doctors and for parents making these decisions. But the Intersex Justice Project essentially is looking for a public apology from the medical field for performing these surgeries, for making parents feel like they were necessary, because likely in any situation, if a doctor came to a parent who doesn't know all of this stuff and is like, hey, they have ambiguous or atypical genitals and we want to perform this so they will live more healthy, then a parent will probably be like, yeah, that makes sense, right? And so going into detail about what this means and getting that apology and putting more resources towards actually understanding and giving more agency or allowing the intersex person to have more agency is really what this is advocating for. So stopping medically unnecessary cosmetic procedures is the aim, in reparations for free medical care. This is really important because, like I said earlier, often it's not just one surgery when you're young, it's surgery throughout your life to keep your body aligned in this way that they had chosen when you were first born. Here is the film I hoped that you would watch. It's called Intersection. It was put out in 2012. It does go over the medicalization of intersex identities, but it goes into detail about how these intersex people specifically kind of experienced being intersex, the shame that they experienced, the stigma that they experienced, feeling alone that no one else was like them or no one really understood. So I encourage you all to really watch that, build empathy, build understanding, and build advocacy for intersex and trans individuals, because even in the LGBTQIA plus community, we really lack understanding about intersex individuals. So I'm going to go ahead and invite Nathan back, and we'll talk about what this resource is and is not. And so, like I said earlier, I tried to get through that chromosome stuff at the human level. I swear I will make it more clear next time. This was the first time I was trying to explain it, but hopefully you've got the takeaway that, hey, sex and gender varies. There's variety in humans and in wildlife.
Yeah, I think one of the main things is that this is just kind of a starting point for a lot, and this is not a finite, and we're approaching this both from our respective fields. One of our main goals is that we kind of expand the definition, and also if you see these arguments about biological sex, now you have a YouTube video that you can just link so you don't have to remember all of the information.
So our hope here is that, we expanded your understanding of the concept of sex, that you are walking away with more knowledge so that you can affirm intersex and trans identities, that, when people use the biological arguments in a hostile way, that you can use some of the knowledge to sway them to understand that, hey, that's not right, that's not true, and that you have some science to rely on to help you push those arguments or stomp those other arguments out.
And one of the things also is, like, for me going into wildlife, I often didn't feel like being gay or queer was biologically relevant. And so through me kind of questioning where I fit within my field. And so I hope that this also helps show that wildlife in these fields are open for everyone and that these identities are affirmed within the field.
All right, so I guess at this point we can see if there's any questions. We will go ahead and stop streaming. At one point, if there are other questions, you can definitely reach out to us individually. We'll be happy to answer. Are there any questions?
And we're not doing, we're solely doing recorded questions, correct?
Right now, yeah. I mean, I think that if you all want to ask us questions, we can always put our emails in the chat, and then therefore you can email questions that aren't recorded.
Yeah.
We also have a feedback form that you all can use to give us feedback.
Yeah, we've done a few iterations of this talk, and so the feedback form is really useful for us to develop and improve upon what this is. There's a question, are most of these studies North American or do they involve cultures from across the globe?
Most of the studies that I looked at were North American.
And I honestly am not positive about mine. I think that there's a mix of publishing nationalities, but I think it's predominantly European and North American.
Okay, well, if there's no other comments, I guess we'll go ahead and stop. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Please fill out the feedback form. This setup is a little bit different, but I am so excited that you all were able to join us, and we hope that we can continue giving this to people who are willing to listen.
And just kind of a final thought, like, this project was started between a group of us earlier this year, and it's a long presentation because we had an inkling of the research, but not a good idea of the breadth of it. And as we continue to develop this talk, we just found more and more information on how diverse and really kind of incredible sex determination can be. But thank you.
Thank you. Bye.